All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the JavaScript DOM. We'll be covering what is the DOM, the HTML script tags, scripts and footers, and what's the difference between having them inside of the footer rather than having them on the header, traversing through the DOM, manipulating the DOM, connecting a main.js file to an HTML. So pretty much moving our JavaScript to an external file. And then we'll cover query selectors, the different types of query selectors. In part two, we'll go over creating elements through the DOM, adding events into those elements through the DOM, and then we'll cover event propagation, and finally, we'll cover working with forms. By the end of today, we'll have a front end that we're eventually going to integrate with the remaining of our full stack application that we've created thus far. We created a backend, and we've created a database for our students, but we haven't created a front end for it yet. So that's what we'll be covering today. So before I start the lesson, does anyone have any questions over anything that we'll be covering today? All right, if there are no questions, let's move on to what is the DOM? Well, we've covered a little bit of JavaScript so far, or sorry, not JavaScript, we've covered a little bit of HTML so far, and we understand that HTML is essentially just boxes within boxes, right? We know that this right here could represent our body. And let me go ahead and place this in the right spot. Within our body, we should have a header our header will also have, not our header, I apologize. Within our header, we'll also have a body. Sorry. All right. Within our body, we'll also have a section named main, which will cover all of our main content. And then at the very bottom, we'll have something called a footer that may or may not stay constant throughout the entire web page. Okay, so there's our header, our main, and our footer. But we also know that our footer may need something along the lines of an nav bar. Go ahead and make everything else smaller over here. All right, so there's our header. Then there's a nested nav bar inside of it. And inside of that nav bar, we may have a couple of ULs and LIs. Our footer may also have a couple of ULs. So let's go ahead and add two of them here. All right, so there's our two ULs. And inside of our main, we may have a couple of divisions. Let's say we have two. All right, there's a div. And here's a secondary div. And maybe inside of this division, we have an image along with a section. All right. And inside of our other division, we just have one massive article. So just like that, we created the wireframe of our web page, right? That's supposed to show an image with a small description, and then at the very bottom show a division that's actually holding an article. Well, this is great, and we've already imagined this before, kind of like the Russian doll, right? That the more you open up, the more eggs that come out of it, or there's always a toy inside of it. Well, this is how we break it down in HTML, but how does JavaScript relate to this information, or how is it able to talk to it? Well, if I were to introduce this into JavaScript, I would say that JavaScript is essentially just a tree, right? So we start off from the very bottom, and then from there, the tree may or may not have a couple of branches that break out and drop into separate topics. So for example, what's the very top part of our HTML document on the left-hand side?
The body.
Okay, so I can go ahead and insert the body, being the very top part of my HTML document. And my HTML document has has three separate branches, right? What are these three branches here?
Header, main, and footer.
Perfect. So we have our header, main, and footer. All right. And if I keep breaking down my header, oh, don't want that. Let's say I keep breaking down my header. How many elements does my header have? So here's my header. I'm going to go ahead and dash it out. Okay, it has just one. And which element would that be? And I see Nika on the chat saying that it's a navbar. Awesome. So I can go ahead and say, well, it has a navbar inside of it. So I could save with space. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. Okay, well, what about our main? How many elements does main have?
Does it have two?
Right,
Children?
it does have two. Okay, so let's take a look at that. All right, we have two children there. And both of those children are what?
The divs.
They're both divs.
Exactly, they are both divisions. So now I'm going to come over, make a couple of divs here. Okay, so there's my two divs. Well, now we run into the issue of, well, now that we have these two divs, those divs also have children. So what do those children look like? So the first division, how many children does it have?
Got two. An
Okay, so
image
it's
and a
got two.
section.
Perfect. So we can go ahead and say, all right, you have an image and you have a section. Okay. And then our final division only has one article. Okay, so now we broke it down into a tree. I'm not going to go into the footer. I'm pretty sure by this point we all get the idea, right? We could have a body. Each one of those elements has a tree, and that tree holds all of its parent children. Well, think about this as a dictionary in this case, right? If I were to think about this as a dictionary, for example, if we take a look at the Pokey API, and we take a look at it as a dictionary, let's say abilities was an HTML document, right? Well, abilities would have a number of children elements, and that would be 0 and 1 because it's an array. And each one of those would also be a dictionary holding other key elements. So if we take a look at this, well, what this would do would be this line right here of tree would be body.children. And that would be equal to an array saying header, main, or footer. So now that I know the equivalent of that, how could I get all the way down to this image tag if I were traversing through this? what would be the next index that I want to enter within this array? If I were to start at the body. Okay, so I see someone saying header.children. Remember, I want to go into main, then into the first division, and then down to the first image. So I'm starting at the body, right? So we know that body.children brings in an array of 3 elements. Well, which index from that array do I want to enter? Okay, so I want to enter index 1 because that's going to take me into main. Okay, now how do I access the children of main?
Do you do children again?
Yeah, I would just do dot children again because each one of these properties has children, right? And that array will either be 0 if they don't have any children, or it will have indexes if they do have children. So I'm walking into the body dot children. I enter index 1, which takes me into main. And now I'm going into the children, which in this case, I got a division and another division placed in here. And I see a question from Kara. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious, would you not be able to also just continue with the bracket notation instead of going to like dot children?
Would you be able to continue with bracket notation? We're going to cover that right now when we look at it through the console, but that's a really good question. We could utilize bracket notation because this is going to be actually interpreted as an object within the Chrome browser. So you could straight go with bracket notations and just put quotation marks because each one of those will be keys, or you could go with dot notation for keys because they're objects. Does that answer your question, Kara?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Of course. All right, so now I'm within the children of main, and I'm trying to get down to this image tag. So which one of these 2 indexes do I want to enter? Okay, I see Yams on the chat saying index 0. So I enter index 0, and that takes me down here. So now I want to access the image. How do I get to image from here?
Did you do dot children 0 again?
Dot children index 0. And that would take me down to the image tag. Trying to figure out a good place to put this. There you go. All right. So we're going to utilize JavaScript to iterate through this object, this whole huge object, and get down to this body tag. So let's try to replicate this information that we have here. I'm going to go ahead and open up my HTML document. We've already covered how to utilize HTML, so I'm not going to go over all that, the basic things all over again. I'm going to change this title to school. Here we have our body. We know that it should have a header. We know that it should have a nav bar. And let's just make it real quick. Nothing serious. I'm just going to make those empty. My header should also have a main. That main should have 2 divisions. The first one holding an image, and the second one holding a section. That second division should just have an article. And then finally, after main, I have a footer, which will have 2 UL items. Okay, so let's take a look at this through live server. And I don't think I have the live server installed in this machine, so I'm going to have to install it real quick. I apologize, everyone. Okay, so live server is now installed. Go back over here, make sure I'm selecting my index.html, and I can click on go live. Okay, so it opens up my live server on the right hand side. I don't necessarily have an image, it's using port 55,000. Well, now let's inspect this. We have our head and our body. Within our body, we have header, main, etc. We all understand how this console portion works. I mean, this elements portion works. Well, let's go ahead and enter through the body. Well, if I were to enter through the body, I can say something like document. Oh, dot body. Now, oh, I apologize. Enter doesn't work the same way as it does here. Well, now if I do that, we can see that if I do document.body, it's highlighting the entire body of my HTML document. If I click here, we can see that it still returns all 3 of those elements. Well, it's still just an object, right? I can console.log. Oof, it's going to be rough to. All right, here we go. We can go ahead and do console.log type of. Let's do document.body to see what it returns when I run that. Well, when I run document.body and I return something, it tells me, hey, this is an object. I can enter it through keys as if it were just a regular object, through both bracket notations or through dot notation. So now I can say, well, what if I wanted to see the children? So let's see document.body.children. So let's take a look at the different ones here. So if I look at child elements, it tells me child element count. It tells me I have 4 of them. Well, my body has a header, a footer, and a main. So I wonder what that 4th one is. We'll see that here shortly. So let's go ahead and enter children. Well, we can see that if I do children, it shows me a header, main, footer, and then script. Even though I never declared a script, it still gives me a script portion that I could enter. Okay, so that's my document.body. In the children, we mentioned that to get to that image tag, I have to go into index 1 to be able to grab main. And here we can see the console is telling me that that's main. Maybe I should probably zoom in a little bit. We can see that's telling us it's main. And if I do .children again, now it tells me I have those 2 divisions, right? Well, inside of those 2 divisions, I know that I want to enter index 0. There it is. There's that first division. And lastly, I want to do children. To see how many children are in there. We can see that it tells me that it has an image and a section. And I could enter the image. And there it is. It gives me the image element corresponding with my HTML document. We went over how to traverse it. We're about to go over how manipulating the DOM is useful or how we could do it with JavaScript. But before we go into that, does anyone have any questions over anything I just covered? And does everyone understand how to traverse through the DOM tree?
I just have a question real quick. So just to like reinforce it, so the whole document is an object, but that object, I guess each child element in that object holds a list of their children objects as well, and that's how you traverse it. So like we could use like the keys for like in bracket notation instead of dot, but fundamentally like it's just one giant object with each child having a list of its own child objects.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, thank
It's
you.
all just nested within the children objects. Perfect. All right, I don't see any questions on the chat. So next, let's go over how we could manipulate the DOM. Well, we got all the way down to this image, right? And we did it utilizing JavaScript. But what exactly does that do for us? Does it actually change anything? Do we have any power to do anything to this? Well, we know that the image tag has a couple of properties, right? Let's go ahead and try to grab the image for Charizard here. So I'm going to go ahead and look up Charizard. I'm going to submit. Okay, it's loading. All right. Well, now I don't need abilities. I don't need cries, forms, no game indices, no species, but here we have sprites. Okay, well, sprites sounds like it's an image. And here it gives me a couple of images. It gives me back, for shiny as well. And then it gives me front. Okay, so let's see. We have front default and front shiny. Let's go with front default for now. So now I'm going to copy that information, go back over to my console here. And let's say we have that image, right? Well, we know that image has an attribute named source. So I can actually access this attribute by saying src. So we can see that it tells me, okay, well, what source do you want to set this to? And I can make that equal to and paste the URL. Well, now when I run this command, let's see if it lets me grab back. Got to put that in quotation marks. Now when I run this command, we can see that it's able to grab it. It sends the request and it's able to grab that information. And it grabs my Charizard, right? I essentially just use JavaScript to change my image here. Okay, well, how do I do that with actual HTML? Let's take a look over here. Let's close our console window. If we refresh it, Charizard's going to be gone. But let's create a script that will actually generate that image. Right, so here we have our image. I'm going to write a source tag down at the footer. I'm going to go ahead and make a script tag. I apologize. So I'm going to make a script tag that's going to write my JavaScript. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the same thing that I had in the console before. I believe it's now going to be gone if we take a look at the console. So now we'll just have to write it here. Okay. Well, again, what I want to do is I want to enter the document. I want to grab the body. Within the body, I want to enter the children. Grab index 1, which will take me into main. Go ahead and close that out for now. This as well. Okay. After that takes me into main, I want to again enter the children. And within children, I want to enter the first division, which then takes me into children. And I want to enter index 0, which will be the image. So I'm going to go ahead and say let image equals that, and I'm going to console.log img just to make sure that it's working properly. Well, I wrote this script tag, and all of a sudden I started writing JavaScript into it. Well, we covered this in our HTML lesson a couple of days ago. The script tag is going to allow me to write JavaScript. Now, you may have the question, why am I writing the script tag here in the footer instead of writing it up at the header, since before we did all of our CSS at the head level? I'll cover that here shortly once we go into our async and await tags. So I'm going to go ahead and inspect. I'm going to take a look at my console. And inside of my console, well, I expected to see something along the lines of console.log image, but I'm not seeing that. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh it. Okay. So now that I refreshed it, I can see that it's actually grabbing my image tag. And that's why it's console.logging. I was able to iterate through the document tree to be able to grab my image. Now I could name this whatever I want, right? And it would still keep the same value. So I can name this cat, let's say that. And when I refresh it, it's still going to just console.log my image tag. Nothing changed. The only reason why I'm naming it img is because I know that it's capturing my image. Well, now I can say image.source is equal to, and I can go ahead and put some quotation marks here. And now when my HTML file renders, I can see that it turns into a Charizard. Well, let's see what happens here. I'm at console.log image.source. And I'm going to go ahead and do that same line right down below. Well, we can see the first console.log happens here. This is happening in line 35. So it's telling me in my index HTML on line 35, your console.logging the following line. It comes up empty. Well, that's because my image doesn't have a source. Then I set it to image source to the actual GitHub, to the actual location where this Charizard is located. And then I console.log it again in line 37. Okay. So now I'm able to actually utilize JavaScript in my script tag to actually use some manipulation or change some content inside of my document. There's really no purpose to doing this right now, right? Because it doesn't really add functionality. And why would I do this rather than just placing it inside of my image tag? Well, you guys are right. We're going to add some functionality here shortly. Well, now the question then comes, earlier I covered how we would want that down below at the footer. What happens if I put it up at the header? Well, let's try to refresh it and see what's happening here. Okay, I'm getting a cannot read properties of null, reading children. Why do we think that's happening if I put it at the head level? Go ahead, Edge.
Oh, my bad.
If it's reading top to bottom, the body and all of its children haven't been created yet.
Exactly. It's all being interpreted from the very top coming to the bottom, right? Before we want our CSS here because we want all of our CSS styling to be ready before it starts creating elements. That way, as it's creating elements, the user is already seeing that styling populate. If we put the styling at the bottom, we run the chance that for a split second, our HTML document will populate without any CSS. And then once it finally gets to the bottom of our script, render our CSS. So our CSS should always go at the top. But now because we put the script tag at the top, it's bringing up an error saying, hey, there's no such thing as children1, right? Because our body is going to exist regardless whether we declare it or not. Every document that it renders is going to have a body. But then we go, okay, we'll enter the children of body. And currently at this point, there's no such thing as any children. So when I tell it to enter index 1, it's returning null. And then I tried to enter a property named .children, but it's saying, hey, null doesn't have anything named .children. There's no such thing as that. So right there, it raises an error and tells me that this isn't going to work. Does everyone understand why our script tag must be at the bottom of our document? Go ahead, Will.
Can you possibly put like a defer in the script tag so that so that it can read it correctly?
Yeah, we definitely can. And we're going to cover that here shortly once we move into linking our, actually, you're right. We might as well cover it now. So what Will is bringing up is something called a defer tag. And what the defer tag does is it tells the document, hey, ignore this piece of the HTML until you're done rendering my entire HTML template. So I can add it here as an attribute. And I think, how does it go? I think it goes defer and then it's async, right? I may be wrong.
I think it's just defer. I think if you put just defer, it might work.
Let's try it out. Let's see. Okay, well, let's do a little bit of research real quick. Defer tag in HTML. Let's see. So it's a defer attribute, and it does take async. So it's async presented and then async defer. Oh, no, it is just defer. But it's not deferring it. Interesting.
Francisco, it has a
Yes.
note on here because I followed where you went and it said
Mhm.
it's only for external scripts.
Interesting. Yeah, let's check it out. Okay, so if I try to refresh it, it's not gonna work. And just like was that Ju? No, that was Jasmine, right? Awesome. Yeah, so just like Jasmine said, this is for external scripts. So we'll take a look at that here shortly. I knew that's why I was saving it. I apologize, everyone. So let's go ahead and bring down that line of code down here. And now we have our footer. Okay. So again, this currently doesn't have any functionality. So why am I doing something like this? What benefit do I have out of doing my HTML tags this way? Well, let's add a function here. We have our image tag. And let's go ahead and add a couple of buttons. Let's go ahead and do button times, let's just do 3 of them. All right, and we'll name each one of them a specific Pokemon here. Let's say Squirtle, and of course, Bulbasaur. And hopefully I spelled that correctly.
How important is it that you drop the O on button there?
Very important, thank you. Okay, so there we see. We have our 3 buttons now, each one of them holding the specific Pokemon that I want to render. But now I just need to add a function to these buttons. And we're not really at event listeners yet, so don't pay attention too much to this. But what I wanted to do is that when a user clicks on a button, I wanted to render the specific image for that Pokemon. So I'm going to go ahead and say onClick, I want you to add image. And it's going to be a function. Right now, my console is going to go ahead and throw an error because it's going to say, hey, this doesn't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no function named add image. So currently, I refresh it. I click on it. It says, hey, there's a reference error. Add image is not defined. And you're right. It is not defined yet. Okay, so there we have our onClicks. Well, let's go ahead and grab those sources. I'm going to go ahead and Command X that real quick. I'm going to comment that out. I'm going to pass it in as an argument to our HTML. Something is killing it. Let's see. I think that should actually work. And let's turn this into a function. Let's say const add image takes in 1 argument, which is URL. And what it's going to do is it's going to grab my image tag. I'm going to console.log my image tag prior to it. And then I want to see the actual image being rendered. Okay, so there's my image function. It's going to take in 1 parameter, which is a URL. It's going to grab my image tag. It's going to console.log the original source that it has, change it, and then console.log that source one more time. Okay, so let's refresh it just in case. I click on Charizard, and we can see that the image changes to Charizard. All right. Well, what happens when I do Squirtle or Bulbasaur? Well, nothing happens because I currently don't have any argument. Now, if I change it to empty parentheses. There's Charizard. If I do Squirtle or Bulbasaur, it doesn't seem to be registering that correctly. So now let's go ahead and actually change our image tags. Oh, that's why. Aha. Click on Charizard, Charizard works. Squirtle, Charizard's gone. Right, because we set it back to an empty string. It's taking in that parameter for URL. All right, well, let's do the same for Squirtle. And I don't really think we need Bulbasaur. I kind of just wanted to do Bulbasaur because get all 3 starters. Let's do Squirtle. Okay, so there we see Squirtle coming in. Here's our front default. Gonna go ahead and copy that. And I'm gonna paste it in. Okay, so now I take a look here. Click on Charizard, Charizard populates. Click on Squirtle, Squirtle populates. All right. We have all of our information. Ooh, the IDs might have been useful. That's great. I think here it is with the variable and the function, but I can't see it currently. What's your question, Nika? I apologize.
It wasn't a question I had. Landon had a question.
Oh, okay. Scroll up here on the chat. Oh, yes, you're right, Landon. I was able to catch that right here. I missed it on the image source. Thank you so much. Okay. So now we can see how we utilize JavaScript to change the information, right? We can add this information and change the content that's rendering inside of our script. Well, what if we wanted to have our header say something different? Let's say H1, and let's do hello whiskey. So now we have a header that says hello whiskey. But I want to have a button that changes hello to good evening or good night. All right, let's go ahead and create that button real quick. So button, and let's name it change greeting. Okay, so we saw an example of how we can connect JavaScript to utilize a specific, to do some sort of behavior here. And we iterated through the DOM to be able to grab the element that I wanted to manipulate. So how could I do the same thing to change hello whiskey? So let's start by building our function. And after building our function, I want us to iterate through the tree to grab the H1 element. So who can walk me through that? All right, let's start out with just building the function. Can somebody walk me through building the function template? Go ahead, David.
Sure. So you're gonna do const, whatever you want to call your function, equals in parentheses whatever parameter you're gonna pass it. Right now, keep it empty. Fat arrow, curly braces, space, and then you're gonna say let header,
Okay, so header.
or yeah, header equals document dot body dot children of 0.
Awesome, which will enter the header. All right.
And then dot children of your H1 should be the first thing, so 0 again.
All right.
And then what are we trying to do here? We're trying to change the header text, right?
Correct. We're trying to change it from hello whiskey to good evening whiskey or goodbye whiskey.
Okay, so you should be able to do header, or you should, yeah, header dot text content.
Okay, so text content
Equals whatever you want it to be.
Okay, let's go with good evening. Okay, awesome. So we have our header. And now let's go ahead and plug that function into this button. And can someone else other than David walk me through plugging in that function into this button?
When you add the onClick,
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and say onClick.
and then the name of the function that you used below.
All right, perfect. So we have our onClick with change greeting. Let's go ahead and refresh this. I click it, and we can see how it turns into good evening whiskey. Well, now if I click it again, it stays. So how could I make it alternate back and forth?
Could you like just have it, could you toggle it
Yeah, we
or
could.
just have it change like to do what you had before with good
I think,
morning?
yeah, I think toggling might be the good idea. Let's go ahead and do evening. Let's say let evening be equal to good evening. Let's say let morning equal to hello whiskey. And let's just say if header dot text content is equal to morning. Oh, and I'm writing Python. Apologize. Then I want header dot text content to be equal to evening. Otherwise, I want it to be equal to morning. All right, so let's refresh this. I click it, turns into good evening whiskey. I click it again, turns into hello whiskey. And just like that, I made a toggle that will change my evenings and a button that will change my image that I'm looking for a specific Pokemon. So we just went over iterating through the document object model. We understand the document object model works, how the document is interpreted as a massive object that has children, and you can access each individual element through those children. Then we went over the script tag, why it should be at the footer, and we'll cover how to place it in the header here shortly. And we covered adding functions into our actual HTML. We haven't covered events yet, but we will cover that here shortly. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that I've covered? I see a question on the chat saying, should we make a JS function with the arrow with the keyword or with the keyword function? I've seen them both ways. Is one preferred over another? So the arrow function is actually a new format. I think it's JS6. From now on, we would strongly recommend that you utilize arrow functions rather than actually utilizing the keyword function. I don't want to say that they make a difference under the hood, but there might be some sort of reasoning behind it. I just know that this is the syntax standard that there is now for JavaScript. Does that answer your question, Nika?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Oh, and I see Adam on the chat. He's saying that the main difference is arrow functions have no scope, which is usually not relevant. But we will get into that once we start talking about more advanced JavaScript.
Yeah, it makes life a little, you avoid errors, possible errors sometimes in React, sticking with arrow functions. But you're totally right too, Francisco, just for readability and sort of friendliness in general, they're a good tool to use.
All right. So now we've covered what is the DOM, the HTML script tag, and writing scripts in the footer, traversing and manipulating the DOM. But now let's go over how to connect our JavaScript into a separate file. We don't want our JavaScript to actually be within our HTML, just like we didn't want our CSS to be located within our HTML. So if we take a look at my root folder here, I have Java 4JS DOM. This is our demos and nil folder. And here I have my index.html. And then I have this main.js. We're not going to utilize this just yet, but we will get to that here shortly. But now, let's copy all of this code that we created. So I'm just going to take this entire script tag. Oh, I went too far. There you go. I'm going to take all of this code that I have here, going to cut it out, and get rid of my script tag down at the footer. All right, welcome back, everyone. I am currently sharing my screen. Everyone should see VS Code right now. Can I get a verbal confirmation that everyone sees VS Code? Okay, I see some thumbs up. All right, so before we left, we were just talking about our async script, why defer had to move from down below, and we have our JavaScript image here. What was the last thing we heard before I got unplugged?
I believe you just started talking about moving the JavaScript to a script file.
Okay, awesome. So just a quick review, just in case, because I'm not sure what everyone was able to listen to, and I kept talking to myself, thinking that I was still in the lesson.
That's
We
the
have
worst.
we have this image tag right up here. If we take a look into our index.html, we have at the very top. Oh. Here it is. We have our tag here. I can move it up above, and everything's able to load correctly. All of my functions are there, and that's because of this defer keyword. I took this line 8 to be able to access something within my script because I wanted to make sure that we could all see what happens if I take off this defer. But when I take off defer and I try to refresh it, it tells me, hey, there's an error. You're trying to access something that doesn't exist. That's happening because of here in line 8. Well, when I bring back that defer, what I'm telling this HTML template or telling the browser, because this is in head, is that, hey, when you see this script, I don't want you to start reading it because of this defer. I want you to render everything on my HTML template first, and then start rendering my script. There's a key difference between async defer and defer. By saying async defer, I am running my script asynchronously with my HTML template being rendered. So what that means is it's going to go into document, go into body, access children. It's going to say, hey, I'm trying to access children at index 1. It's going to say, you don't have any children just yet. So it's going to start rendering my body. It'll render my header. And then once it renders main, it says, okay, well, main exists now. So that's what you're talking about. And it'll let me enter this portion and then go into children. They're being executed asynchronously towards one another. Neither of them raise errors because they're both waiting for the element to exist before starting to render anything. All right, async stands for asynchronously, meaning it's happening at the same time. Defer just leaves the script to the very end. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, awesome. I see a question here on the Whiskey chat saying, when we move the JS to a separate file, is it better to have the script in the head? That's a great question. When you have the JavaScript inside of a separate file, it doesn't really, I don't want to say that it matters where exactly it is that you want it, whether you have it on the footer or the header, you're going to get the same result in the very end. I would strongly recommend putting it up in the head, just because like the link tag, it'll make sure that all the syntax is in there is correct before starting to render everything else. But you don't really have to worry about where it's located, whether it's in the head or the footer. Just ensure that the script tag exists and that it's connected properly. If you have it in the head, make sure that it's deferred, or whether it's asynchronous or not. And if you have it in the footer, you don't have to worry about it. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. Pushing forward now. We've gone over manipulating the DOM, connecting our main JS, but now let's go over query selectors. Different types of query selectors that we can utilize to grab a file. Well, you can see this portion of our lecture is actually pretty extensive. It talks about query selectors. And let's go ahead and start here. So query selectors just stand for, hey, how can I grab something? How can I grab something from this document, right? Currently, right now, we've been utilizing document.body, .children, and all of that. But an easier way to do this would be maybe to get element by tag, right? We know that this entire thing only has one tag. So why would I bother going through this entire iteration of going through the whole document object model when I could give IDs or tag names instead of having to do all of this iterating? Well, let's write something that's almost exactly the same here. So I'm going to go ahead and say let image be equal to document dot get element, and here it tells you a couple of options we have. So it tells you get element by class name, by tag name in S. But in this case, what I want to use is tag name. And the tag that I'm specifically looking for is image, img. I look at my HTML document. That's the only image that I have, right? Well, now let's refresh it. Click on Charizard. Okay, see it's undefined. Click on Squirtle, nothing's happening. It's not actually changing that information. So let image get document, get elements by tag name. Okay, well, get elements by tag name. I wonder what that's returning. Is it returning 1 or is it returning multiples? Let's take a look here. Let's go ahead and console.log image. Okay, so we can see that it's returning an HTML document, right? But it's an HTML collection. And look at what kind of character we see next to that HTML collection. We see this square bracket, which tells me that the square bracket is an array. Right? So I wonder what happens if I do console.log 0. And then I click on that function. Well, now I actually get my image. So let's see if I could do that. Let's see if it will work if I do it this way. Gonna refresh it, click it, look at that. It was able to get all the documents by image. It returned an array of the collected image tags, grabbed the very first one, and changed its current content. So that's get elements by tag name. It's a little bit simpler, but I'm still doing some sort of iteration. If I have multiple image tags, how do I know which one of these image tags I'm going to have to grab? And I have to kind of guess which ones are ordered because I'm using something like Flexbox and it's reversed. Well, now my divisions are being displayed backwards, and it's a little bit harder to iterate through the document. So what would be a more unique way of identifying one specific image tag inside of my index HTML? The key word being unique. Go ahead, Tom.
If you gave it an ID and then you got element by ID.
Yeah, so I could go ahead and say ID is equal to Pokemon image. All right, so now I gave an ID. And rather than doing document get elements by tag name, I can say get element because it's unique. It knows that there will only be one. I can say by ID. And here I can say Pokemon image. And I think that's exactly what I named it. Okay, Pokemon IMG. All right, well, let's take a look here. Click on Charizard. Click on Squirtle. And it's able to make my switches between the two functions. All right, I didn't have to iterate through the entire document object model. I was able to just grab a specific part of my document by the ID. Everything that belongs to an HTML attribute is also included in here. Right? I can make this have a border. So we saw how we have an image source. I can say image border. And I can make that equal to, oh, I apologies. I have to enter the style attribute. And then from style, I can say border. And I can say is equal to solid, black, and has 5 pixels. Okay, so now when I click on Charizard, we see a black border appearing with 5 pixels, right? It's image dot whatever attribute I'm trying to enter, and then if I'm trying to give it a value, I can provide it a value. All right. So we just went over get elements by tag name. We went over get element by ID, which brings you back a unique one. Well, what about get elements by class name? What could that fall into? Well, I see this section and this article both have text, so maybe I could give them a class name of rand text. I'm gonna do the same thing down here. And say class is equal to rand text. Well, maybe I want my random text to have something different, right? Let's say I want to enter these random text when a image populates, and I want to go ahead and say, well, let text be equal to document dot get element by class name. Say rand text. And let's take a look at what that looks like. All right. So we saw that when I grabbed elements by tag name, it returned an array. When I get an element by ID, it returns one specific element. What do we think this will return? Will this return one specific HTML element, or will it return an array of HTML elements? Yeah, we see on the chat, Nika's taking the guess that it will be an array. If I go ahead and click Charizard, we can see an array, which is an HTML collection, where it tells me there is a section that has the class rand text and an article that has the class rand text. Right, it's able to grab 2, and that brings that selection in. All right. Another thing that we can do is utilize something like Query Selector. Query Selector is a bit different in the fact that it collects either one or an array. So here we have rand text, and we have our ID for the Pokemon image, right? So let's do this. Let's do let Q, or I'm just going to say query, be equal to document dot get. Sorry, this is going to be query selector. And let's say that I want to grab something by ID. Well, here I'm specifying that this is an ID, but in query selector, I am not. So I can't just type Pokemon image, because as far as it knows, that's just text. How do I tell query selector that this is an ID? Can anyone take a guess? Go ahead, Tom.
You just use like the attribute notation like you would in CSS. So like a hash for an ID or a dot for a class.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to pass it that hash, letting it know, hey, this is an ID. And let's go ahead and console.log that information. So let's console.log query. Let's take a look what happens here. Okay, so we can see that when I console.log query, it was able to grab my Pokemon image. All right. Well, now what happens when I give it the class rand text? Let's go ahead and look at that. I'm going to trigger the function. And now when the function is triggered, it returns a section. Oh, go away. There you go. It returns a section for rand text, but it didn't return my other division that was an article. Well, query selector grabbed the very first instance of that selector and then returned it as a value. It does not grab multiple, it grabs the very first one. So if I was trying to grab something from classes, I would want to do something like query selector all. And by doing query selector all, it's going to grab all of the instances, not just one. But instead of returning it as an HTML list connection or list Yeah, instead of turning it as an HTML component, it's going to return it as a node list. Right? Which is different than what we had by text. So let's go ahead and console.log text next to it. Click on Charizard. Okay, so here we have our HTML collection. That's coming from text, and that's because I grabbed by class name. And when I bring it in as query selector, it brings it in as a node list. And a node list sounds like what? Sounds like something from linked list, right? We can see that our node list is being collected, and it collects the two different sections or article that have the class brand text. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over query selectors? Okay, if no one has any questions over query selectors, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. All right. So for part 2, what we'll be covering here shortly is going to be, we'll be covering how to create elements through the DOM, how we could add events in events to those elements within the DOM. What is an event propagation, and working with forms. So let's get started. We have our index.html here. Before we start breaking down everything, I'm going to go ahead and comment down everything that we have so far. And I'm just going to leave that as an old version. That way everything's available to us still. I'm just going to go ahead and make a new header, a new main, and a new footer. Okay. So now that we have this information, what I can do is I can ask myself, how could I create elements through the DOM? Well, if I take a look at main.js here, I already have this students array. So what if I want this students array to actually be able to display each individual student for each one of these objects? Right? Well, what can I do here? I can maybe write a function that will iterate through this information and render it. Or I can go to my HTML template and I can name something. Maybe I want something like a division. I'm going to give it an ID that says student container. And this is where all of my students are to be displayed. Actually, I'm going to turn this into a UL. I'm going to make an H3 saying students right up here. And here I'm going to have an H1 for the school. Okay, so we have a school, we have an H3 for students. All of my information is being displayed. And I currently have this UL. Well, what if I wanted each one of these students inside of this array to be displayed inside of index.html? Well, the first thing I would want to do is I would want to grab this main document. After grabbing this main document, and actually, let's go ahead and make a new drawing here. After grabbing this main document, well, what I could do is I can access the UL. Don't want that in that color. And I can make a function that adds an li holding student information. So I need a JavaScript function that will make student information in a way that I would want to display it and add it into my UL. So if I wanted to make a function that looks like this, how can I make that function in main.js?
we have this ID for student container. And I want to simply iterate through an array of objects to create content on my screen. What could I do here? Okay, so I see there's a couple of things on the chat. We see loop with for in. We see within your loop, I can create elements. Okay, awesome. Tom? I don't know, I think Tom's mic is down. All right, no problem at all. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and make a function named get students. And for now, this function is going to work with this array of students up here, which is an array of objects. And I'm going to go ahead and create list items that will fall within my UL. So first, I want to grab the container, which is my UL. And I believe I named that student container. So let's say let student container be equal to document dot get element. Which query would I want to use to grab this UL? What could I use there for a query selector?
Get element by ID.
So if I can say get element by ID, and I can say that the ID that I want to use is student container. So that grabs me my UL. Well, what about all of these LIs? What can I do? Well, I can map through each one of the students. So I can say students dot map. For each one of the students, I want to reference it as stud. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list item. Well, we haven't gone over how to create elements yet. But as you can expect, you can enter document. And if you do dot, you'll see create attribute, create different things here. We can even create an event. But what I want to do is I want to create an element. I'm going to say let list item equals create element list item. So that's going to create a list item. And that list item should then render all this information. So I'm going to say li dot inner HTML. I could do either inner HTML or text content, whichever one I would like to use. I could also do something like inner text. I can make that equal to, and I could utilize interpolated string to say ID is stud.id. We can say name. And again, I could use interpolated string here to say stud dot first name. I'm just going to do stud dot last name as well. And then I can say age. Going back and forth between the languages is starting to have a little bit of a cost in my typing abilities. I apologize, everyone. And finally, we go into grade. You can see stud, not grade. Okay. So now we have a list item that will display this string for each one of the students within this stud, the students array. How do I get them to actually go into students? Well, earlier we talked about something called children. And we saw how children is interpreted as an array. So if that's the case, I can assume that I can have some sort of append function, such as append child. And when I append this child, I just need to tell this function, what is it that I'm trying to append? Well, I'm trying to append my list item. All right. Does anyone have any questions over this function or what it's doing? Okay, I see a question from Nika down below where she's asking, why am I utilizing map instead of a for loop? I could utilize a for loop to start doing this. But in front-end development, as you'll see in other frameworks, for loops aren't necessarily what's accepted when you're trying to return HTML. Most of the times, you'll have to utilize the mapping function. So the reason why I'm utilizing map here is to get us all used to the syntax, getting used to seeing students.map rather than a for loop, so that when we go into React, this doesn't come as a surprise. Does that answer your question, Nika?
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, I see a question from Donnie where it says, does JS have a method like ** in Python we learned for CSV? It does, actually. It's not necessarily a method like **, but you can deconstruct, right? So what you can do is you can say, I want to grab ID, first name, last name, age, and grade. And you could grab those all from stud. And I'm not sure if that has to be a const or if I could use let. I think I could use let. And then from there, you could utilize ID. But let me get it to render on the screen first before I make that drastic change. But you could do something like that to deconstruct an object. Does that answer your question, Donnie?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right, well, let's see this function in action. Currently, I'm not calling the function. All right, if I take a look at my school over here, this isn't being called. Well, maybe I want to add this function as a button. Maybe I have something that says get students. So let's go ahead and add this button here. Let's say we want to get students. And we want to add it as an onClick, which I believe it is called get students. Let me make sure it is called get students. Okay, perfect. Well, now when I click this, again, on-call error. Li is not defined at get students. Let's see where that's coming from. Okay, and it's happening on line 16. That's what I'm getting told here. Okay, well, Li isn't defined on line 16, and that's because it's out of scope. Right? Li is being defined within my mapping function, but I am not currently placing it within the loop. Now, when I click get students, we can see that each one of those students populates. Instead of the object, we can actually see each one of our students, and each one is being populated as a list item through JavaScript. So let's break down our function one more time. Our function is going to grab the container, which is a UL item. So here we see a UL element of student container. So that's what we grab it as, and we save it as a variable named student container. From there, we map through our array of objects for each student, and for each student, we run the following function. We create a list item, then we set the list item's inner text to the student's information, and then we grab the UL element or student container and append our list item, which holds our student, into that unordered list. And that's how we get each one of these students being rendered on the screen. If I refresh it, they'll be gone. And when I click get students, I see my students being rendered on the screen. Does anyone have any questions over this function? All right. If no one has any questions over this, we're going to go over adding event listeners, or what is an event? Well, so far we've been utilizing this onClick on all of these buttons that we've created. And as you can see, I can keep clicking the onClick, and every single time the event of a click happens, I get more students. Well, almost everything inside of your browser is an event. When you hover over a button, we know that that's an event, right? We can change the functionality to JavaScript to be manipulated. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to do the remaining code within the footer, just to make sure that we have some different styling here. Okay, so this one, let's make it with 300 pixels, and then after that, we'll cut down slowly for each one of them. All right, so there we could see it falling. Maybe you want to change this a little bit. Let's go ahead and give this green. And let's do this one. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Here we go. Let's do this one red. All right, so there's our three boxes. All right, each one of them falling within one another. But I want to see the events between each one of them. Well, let's say that we create a couple of functions here that will change the color. Let's say onClick, or let's have a function saying fill in color. So let's say const fill color. And this is going to take in a color attribute. And then it's going to just grab the element. So document dot get element. And actually I could have it take in the event as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say let element be equal to event dot target. So that is where the event happens. And it looks like element isn't the right thing. So I'm going to go ahead and say, what is going on here? Why are you angry? Unexpected. Oh, there you go. Arrow function. All right. So now I have my element coming in. It's taking in an event. And then I'm telling it, all right, well, now that you've taken this event, I want you to find where this event happened. And then I want you to change the color. So I'm going to go ahead and say element dot style dot background color. That's going to equal color. All right. Well, let's take a step by step here. What happens with the event? I'm going to go ahead and go to index.html. And I'm going to start with our smallest green square. I'm going to say on hover. Oh, can't do that. Let's go ahead and do onClick instead. And do something like fill color, which is our function. And then it's got to take in a color. So we'll say green. All right. So when I click this function, it's gonna grab a target or an element. And then after that, it's gonna go ahead and fill in the color. Or at least that's what I expect it to do. But you can see that it gets a problem. Oh, and it got it at style. Well, let's go ahead and console.log element as well to see what comes back. But when I click it, we see the first argument being green, so it's passing it in wrong. Okay, looks like I need to pass the element in here or the event. All right. So now it's working. We can see the event and it's telling us what our event is actually doing. So we can see there was a pointer event that was trusted. It's being true. The pointer ID is 1. The width and height of my cursor is 1. And the pressure is 0. Well, let's take a look here. What else is happening here? It's giving me where in the altitude it's happening. It's giving me an X and Y axis in reference to the screen so that I can find where exactly it is that the click happened. Coming in from mouse, that's my pointer type. And it gives me a source element. Well, if I keep going into this, there's going to be something named target that I may be missing here. Oh, here we go. So target is representing where did this element actually happen? Where did this event happen? Well, when I clicked on it, it's telling me that the source of this target is a division. So now that division is what gets selected. I didn't have to use a query selector to be able to graph this division because that's where I'm setting my event handler at. So it was able to tell me, hey, this event happened on this, the very first, my very smallest square. It triggered that, and I was able to find that target and console.log that element. Well, now I can change its background to green. Does anyone have any questions regarding how that event worked or how I broke down that event to be able to grab a division and change its color? I see a request to going back to the HTML file. Is there a specific spot in the HTML file you would like me to go back to?
I just needed to see that. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course. All right, if there are no questions, let's go ahead and move on to adding the same functionality to the other two divisions. I'm going to go ahead and copy my onClick function. And then I'm going to change the styles. So one will be to black, and one will be to red. Now, all of these are nested within one another, right? And actually, let me go ahead and give it one last style, just so that it looks the same all across. Okay, so there we see our boxes. They're all centered between one another. We have all three of our boxes. And we passed in the fill color, the fill color function in. So I know that when I click on that green box, that box should turn green. And when I click on the red box, that box should turn red. Well, let's see what happens when I click on the green box right now. Well, when I clicked on the green box, it looked like it was able to find the event, but currently the color is black. Why is that happening? Go ahead, Brian.
Is that because of propagation? The event is bubbling up through all the containing elements until it stops, basically.
That's exactly what's happening. Yeah, so it's called propagation. Or sorry, let's see, propagation. Yeah. And what it's actually doing is when it gets triggered, it's trickling all the way down. It's saying, okay, well, even though I'm clicking on the green box, the function that's actually being triggered, and let me draw it out over here so that we can see it here. So we have our black box. Then I believe we have our red box. And then finally we have our green box. Well, even though I'm clicking in here at the green level, the event that's being triggered is the one that belongs to the black box on the outside. It's the parent, right? Because that's the one that's being clicked. Even though the event originated at the green box, the function that was triggered was the one at the top. So how do I stop that from happening? Well, we have something called event propagation, and we can prevent that from happening. We can say event dot stop propagation. All right, now if we go back to our school, we refresh it. If I click on the green box, we can see that the green is what was filled. Well, now it knows that I should grab the exact element that I clicked on. And if there's any other function that belongs to the parent, it doesn't matter. It's not going to trickle down. Only the ones on the outside are what will be triggered, not all the way to the parent level. Does anyone have any questions regarding propagation or events? All right. If there are no questions regarding propagations or events, the next thing that we're going to go into is how to add events to elements that we're creating through JavaScript by adding events through JS. So now this part can get a little tricky, and it gets a little bit kind of, I don't want to say intense, but it does get a little bit confusing since we're already working within some elements, right? I'm already creating this list item here. I'm going to work within this list item to add a function where every time I click on something, I am crossing it out. But that means I need to change this a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and create a function, and that function will be triggered for every single one of these elements. So let's go ahead and create our function real quick. And we'll start off small. First, our function will just change the background color every time our mouse moves over and our mouse moves out. So if I go ahead and I start creating this function here, I'm going to say li dot add event listener. And that add event listener is going to take two arguments. One being the mouse, being the event that's happening, and two, the function that you want to be executed when that event happens. So I want that upon the mouse coming over the element, I want an event to be triggered. And that event will then create or have a functionality where I'm going to grab the target of said event. I'm going to change the style. I'm going to make it where the background color. Oh, that's wrong. Is yellow. Just to show it being highlighted. This is the current student that you are hovering over. All right, Let's try that out. I'm gonna get my students, and when I hover over it, we see it turn yellow. But when I hover back out, they're not changing colors back. Well, that's because I need to add another event listener. So I created an event listener for mousing over where the background color turned yellow. Well, now I want to create an event listener where the mouse hovers out. It's going to change the background color to none. Can someone in the class walk me through creating that event listener?
Are you trying to use mouse out or remove event listener?
Mouse out.
Okay. Li dot add event listener,
All right.
and then mouse out, and comma event, and then event dot target dot style dot background color equals white.
Okay, we can do white.
Could you do unset for the background color as well? Or maybe that's CSS I'm thinking of.
What I would go with is something like null.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would get the students, and then when I hover, it turns yellow. But as soon as I hover out, that yellow goes away. And now I have this highlighting thing. All right, maybe I want it to pop up as well. Maybe I can do something like event.target dot style dot font size. I think that's what it is. And maybe I want to make it equal to 10 pixels when I run this. Oh, that's on the wrong one. And I don't know what its default was. So I'm just going to change this back to null. Saying that the property no longer has it. So now I get students. Oh, that made it smaller, not bigger. All right, so let's go with something like 30 instead. Get my students. When I hover it, it turns big, and then it goes backwards. And now I created this highlighting effect for every student that I hover over. Does anyone have any questions over adding event listeners through JavaScript? Okay. There are no questions. So the last thing that we'll cover, and let me make sure that it is actually the last thing that we'll cover. It is not the last thing that we'll cover. We still have to cover working with forms. The next functionality that we're going to add here is we're going to add an onClick function to each one of these list items. Whenever I click on one of these list items, I want to make sure that it gets crossed out. Can someone walk me through adding an event listener that will be triggered when I click on a list item, and it will put a line through the entire list item? How could I do that?
Could you just build it the same way you did with the other two with an li dot add event listener? And you said you wanted to happen when you click, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then we would do it for the click or on click. Well, yeah, click. And wouldn't you be able to oh, I can't see anything. So you would still do the event, right?
Right.
And then would you just put for the event target style, I forgot what it's called. I don't know if it's text or not, but I know that you would do something called is it called strike through, I think? So you would just, I don't know if it's that side or if you would just do it on the other side of the equal sign. I don't know about that one. I'm not sure.
Okay, let's try it out. And see if that works.
Ah, text decoration. Thank you. I didn't remember that part.
Text decoration equals strike through. And I'm assuming this is strike through this way. Hopefully I spelled that correctly. Oh, I see something on the chat. Let me see if this works. Okay, that didn't work. I think someone is saying to take off the dash. Okay, so now we get students. It's not working. Let's check out why it's not working.
Maybe line through.
Okay, let's try that.
With
All right.
with a dash.
Oh, with a dash?
Yeah, Google says line through with a dash.
All right. We get students, we click, and there it is, line through. All right, and now we can see how we're crossing out independent items. Okay, at this point, we've worked with event listeners a pretty good amount. We went over 3 different examples, and I want everyone to make sure that they understand that event.target grabs the source of the event. Wherever the event is happening is being represented by .target. That's why I don't have to do something like document.getElementById, is because I'm grabbing the target where the event is being triggered. All right. So now the last part that we got to work on is working with forms. I'm sure we've all seen forms at least a couple of times by now, but let's go ahead and take a look at a new form example here. Let's say that we wanted to add a new student. Well, what I would do is I would create a form, and that form would have an input for each one of these fields. So this form would have an input field for name. So I could say something like name, or even better, I'm just going to go ahead and do this. We're going to do type text, where the placeholder will be name. Okay, then we're going to have an input field, which is going to be type integer, which is a number. And we could set a max to min range. I don't remember how to do that off the top of my head. So for now, because we're starting to run out of time, we're going to leave it this way. So there's our number, there's our placeholder, and I mean our name, and we could also make one for grade. We're not going to put any sort of validators for these. We just want this input form to exist. So there we can see our 3 inputs, and we can finally make an input type submit. So now we have all 4 of our actual fields here. I'm going to comment out this footer so that it doesn't get in our way. Now we have this form, and it should be able to generate students and add those students over to our getStudents function. Well, I can maybe able to do something like, hey, just add the students. Maybe I could put the same function and pass all of these parameters. But how do I get this data to populate within JavaScript? We'll see later on in React, it's going to be a lot simpler. But when you're working with just pure HTML and JavaScript, you kind of have to grab each one by their independent names or IDs. So let's go ahead and start passing in some names here. I'm going to give it a name attribute. The only one that shouldn't have a name attribute that I gave it to should be my type submit. And I'm just going to say grade. And this should be first name. And maybe I should specify in my placeholder as well. That one should be last name. Here we could put our age, which is a type of number, and then we have our grade. Okay. So now we have all of our HTML, or all of our attributes that should fall for a student. And we gave them all names. We don't necessarily have to wear an ID. We could if we want to, but at this point, it's not really necessary. Well, now, how do I grab this information to be able to create a student within my unordered list? Let's go ahead and start creating that. I'm going to go over to main.js, and I'm going to make a new function named add students. So const add student. And this is going to take an event, because what I'm doing is I am submitting a form, which is on submit, a form of event. Well, we've gone over forms before, and I've told everyone that when I click on the submit button, we see how this question mark comes up in my URL. Well, it's because it's actually sending a request, and we can see how my browser is refreshing every single time I do that as well. Right, if I go back to index.html and I click on submit, we see a refresh. So it's actually sending a request and refreshing all of my HTML content. Well, I have get students, and then I submit my form. Well, all of my students went away. That's because I triggered a re-render, right? All of my HTML template was being re-rendered upon request. So I don't want to do that. I want to stop the form from refreshing my page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event dot prevent default. I am taking away the default behavior that belongs to my form. Now that I've taken away the default behavior, I can start grabbing data out of my form. Okay, and to grab data out of my form, all I'm going to do is I'm going to do object. Well, one, I need to form data, and then two, then I need to extrapolate that data from the form data, which is going to be a bit weird. So we prevented the default. Now I'm going to say, let data be equal to new form data. Form data is a class that belongs to JavaScript. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to tell it, hey, there is a form coming in and it's sending information. And I need to grab that information out of that form, but I need to grab it as a dictionary. So I'm going to, it's the one thing that it needs is it needs to know what form are you talking about? Where am I supposed to grab this information from? So I'm going to pass it the target. And let's take a look at the form so far. Let's say I do F, A, 2, and A. I'm going to inspect it, go over to the console real quick so that we could see this information. Okay. Well, now I submitted, and it looks like it was still triggered. That's because I never added the function into my form. So let's add that real quick. Let's say on submit, I want you to trigger the add student function. You're going to take in an event. Okay, so let's try that again. We do F, A, let's do 2, and A. So now I submit, and I get this form data. This form data doesn't really give me anything. It just tells me, hey, I'm a form. There's supposed to be some data in here, but it's not giving me much information or anything to work with. Well, that's because I'm not done formatting it yet. Now that I gave it the target, I can grab the object. So let's say let formatted data be equal to, and I'm going to grab an object. I'm going to take create an object from data. Now I'm just going to console.log that formatted data. And let's try this again. We do F, A, passing a number, and let's do A. Well, now it's giving me an actual object because it was able to take that data that I passed it in and create an object out of it with the key of age, first, grade, and last. Notice everything is being interpreted as a string, regardless whether it's a number or not, so you need to make sure you account for that. And notice that I never passed in an A. Now I see this age, first, grade, and last. Where are these keys coming from? I'm not doing it within JavaScript, so where are they coming from?
From the input names?
Yeah, if I take a look at input, all of the name attributes match those keys coming in. Okay, great. So now now that I have this dictionary, right, maybe I could clean it up so that I could follow the same functionality down here of creating a stud, right? Maybe I can make a function that will say create element for each individual stud. I don't really want to refactor that much currently right now. Do we have enough time? We do have enough time. Let's refactor. Let's make a function for creating a list item. So const create student item. It's going to take in a student, and it's going to return some sort of list item element. Well, now I'm going to take all of this functionality here. I'm going to pass it to this create list item or create student item, which will create a list item for me. Let me clean that up a little bit. All right, so there we see that it passes in stud. It can reference to all of the keys still. Well, now that I did that, I could just do create student item and pass in the stud as the attribute. So let's make sure that still works. Okay, that's still working properly. We're still good there. Now let's clean up this form data. So in index.html, I'm going to change this to first name, change this to last name. Age is right, grade is right. Okay. And I believe that is all I need to add there. It may need an ID. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and give it where all of them are going to be equal to ID. All right, so now I have this object. Awesome. So now I can say formatted data dot ID, or do square brackets ID, make that equal to, for now I'm just going to do the number 1 because we don't have enough time to add the logic. And then finally I can say that I have this information. I have a complete student. Well, now I can do the create student item and pass in the formatted data. Okay, so let's take a look at what we got. I can get students. It gives me all of my students. Now I can create a student. Let's go ahead and create one for Adam. His age is unknown, so I'm gonna go with 25, and grade is A. And now we can see that Adam has been added. My form isn't cleared. I can clear my form if I wanted to. I can grab these elements by ID and clear them, or I could do something else to actually be able to clear this entire form. But let's go ahead and create one for me now. Not sure why not. And now we can see that Francisco has also been created. I can change the logic later on to make sure that I have current IDs. I still have the functionality to be able to scratch out items as I go through them. And that is it as far as working through forms. Again, Forms will automatically send a request, so we want to prevent the default of the form. After preventing the default of the form, we want to grab the data coming in from the form. Once we have that data, we can format it into an object. And once we format it into an object, that's all it is. It's just an object. There's no type of special data structure like form data. We just have an object. We can add a key, we can remove a key, we could change the values inside of it. And after that, we can pass that object into our create student item, which will just create an item for each student. Does anyone have any questions over this form data or how to handle forms? No questions at all. Yams?
I guess I might have missed it, but in the create a student function above add a student, where did we state that we're appending? I mean, I see where we're appending, but where's the student container still coming from? Is that because we still call it down in the bottom in our first
Yeah, it looks like it's, so this is where the being out of scope comes in. This should not be here. All right, this line down here of the student container. Instead, it should be right up here. But this is where the out of scope comes in. By utilizing arrow functions, it wasn't creating a scope, meaning that I was able to grab variables that were declared down below without it raising an error. Does that answer your question yet?
Yeah, it's just strange that that still worked. But,
Yeah,
okay.
I agree. Natalie?
Oh, sorry. So for the stop propagation method before, the whole reason why we use that is because the parent element also had an event listener and an event that was occurring. And so we just didn't want it to occur to the child when we click the child element.
Right, so we only want the event desired to be triggered, right? I don't want all of them to be triggered. Oh, hello. So I only want this one child to be triggered. If I didn't have the event propagation, it would trigger all three of these, all of the parents, all the way down to the child. But because I have this stop propagation, it only triggers at the element itself and not all the way down. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Of course. Any other questions? Natalie?
Actually, yeah, I have another question. So
Yeah.
with the form tag, is that mostly like how we were talking about when we were doing HTML, that's for like syntax for other developers to know that we have a form going in here? Or I guess you said it automatically sends information to the browser when we use form tags?
Right, so form tags come in with functionalities, and it actually has functions attached to it. So if you utilize a form, that's not a thing that's for, oh man, I can't remember the name that I used for it, but it's not just to make it look pretty or to separate your code. Form tags have a purpose for them. They are there to input or grab input of specific information and send that information back to the browser or being handled within your JavaScript code. That's why we had that event prevent default so that it wouldn't reset the browser, but that data is still being captured through line 29. If I didn't have this form in my index HTML, I would have had to grab each individual input field by some sort of ID or class name, and then grab each individual value, which works, but it's just not the proper way of doing it. Also, by utilizing forms, you could do something like, I don't have to press the submit button. I could just press enter and it will trigger the functionality. Whereas if you didn't use a form, you would force the user to click on that submit button because that's where your onClick function would happen. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right, any other questions? Okay, if there are no questions, let's go ahead and do a quick overview over what we covered today. We covered what is the document object model. We covered the HTML script tag. What's the difference between placing our script tag in the footer or the header? We covered the traversing through the DOM, how to manipulate the DOM with JavaScript, how to connect an external JS file to our index HTML through the script tag, and utilizing the source attribute. We covered the different type of query selectors, how to create an element through the DOM, adding events within JavaScript into the DOM, what is event propagation, and how to work with forms. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that we covered during today's lecture? All right, if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.